Welcome to EPG Pathshala. We are discussing today the course on social policy. The specific module under discussion is shelter and housing. I am Sohini Sengupta, a faculty in the School of Social Work at the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. Housing and shelter is a basic human right and a prerequisite to ensure security of livelihood and access to other forms of social goods such as education, health, and employment. Violation of housing related rights emerge from a number of factors. In present times, forced and distressed migration, land grabbing, infrastructure and development growth, and escalated conflicts may lead to forceful evictions of people from land or places they occupy and where they live. Inadequate housing situation is compounded by the fact that there are no comprehensive national housing policy or framework in the context of India. As a result, the poor in both urban and rural areas are in a perpetual state of inadequate housing and insecurity. The objective in this module is to understand the issue of shelter and why it is considered to be a social right. We'll also try to look at the state of housing for the poor, especially in the urban context. We'll look at key policies that support shelter. We will also look at recent changes in shelter policies and the consequences for rural and urban poor. Housing has been described as a human right. Housing and shelter is described as a basic human right and prerequisite to ensure security of livelihood and access to other social goods. Populations who are frequently moving, populations who do not have a place where they live constantly, populations who are characterized by unsafe housing conditions are usually also unable to access a range of social goods, public goods and services such as education, health and employment which are available in locations where they tend to live. Currently, India faces a housing crisis for the urban poor, a situation that is likely to worsen in the future. In 2011, out of the 377 million people, the 31% of the total population who lived in cities, 65 million or 27% of urban population lived in extreme poverty in urban informal settlements, which are more commonly called slums. Urban informal settlements or slum personify what is called insecure housing. According to the United Nations Human Settlements Program, slums are areas where households lack security of tenure, durable housing, sufficient living space, or easy access to safe water or adequate sanitation facility. Which essentially means that a large number of people in the growing cities of India are living in contexts which are very, very detrimental to their social and economic well-being. The 2011 census states that there are 100,000 slum blocks in the country, housing a population between 1,300 households in places like Nochikuppam in Chennai to 86,000 households in what is called the largest slum of Asia in Dharavi in Mumbai. In most of these slum blocks, the infrastructure and public services are deficient and the quality of life can be dehumanizing. Many such places also become vulnerable to natural hazards, and the quality of housing means that various other forms of hazards like fire hazards are very common. One of the deficiencies that characterizes urban housing for the poor in the context of India is the deficiency of services. In the slums, 58% have open or no drainage, 26% do not have access to clean drinking water, 43% bring water from outside for their communities, and 34% have no public toilets in their surrounding, which essentially means that although cities may have good provisions of safe drinking water and sanitation facilities and sewage disposal system as compared to, say, rural areas and hinterland, sections of the population within the city may not be able to access these services, primarily because of the nature of insecure housing and habitation that they occupy. The situation of inadequate housing is not only limited to the urban areas, the rural housing shortage in India is also projected to be 62 million in 2012. Rural households too lack access to basic public services such as improved sources of drinking water, sanitation, waste disposal, and adequate education and health facilities, especially in geographically remote locations. Cities are also increasingly being considered hazard prone. It is subjected to land pressure due to conflicting use. Construction of housing in such situations takes place on land that can be considered unsafe, such as waterlogged or low-lying areas. Poor quality and unsafe construction means that houses are at risk of fire hazards, and they're also at risk of collapse. Working in unsafe environment, informal sector and hazardous industries are often coinciding with places where people also live. Unregulated and are exposed to all forms of hazardous chemicals and other emissions. Unregulated growth and population concentration in areas of economic prosperity means that there's high levels of congestion and the possibility of spread of creation of public health issues. Poorer population groups with low income and unmet basic needs are more at risk from cyclones, floods, earthquakes, crime, fire, and industrial accidents, primarily because of the way in which their settlements are located in insecure conditions and created out of material which are poor quality, and the fact that they lack access to basic services. A very large number of people who live in urban areas, especially in low and middle income countries, are impoverished. The urban poor also live in poorly constructed, overcrowded housing that lack basic services and facilities, and these are called informal settlements. These households typically lack access to water and sanitation, as we have discussed. And not taking into account the high cost of non-food needs in urban areas, in poverty assessment may imply that informal settlement dwellers are sometimes not counted as poor. This is a very interesting point for those who are interested in creating social policies that can actually transform people's lives. When we look at poverty assessment, we tend to look at people's incomes, and the urban poor on the whole may have higher incomes than the rural poor. However, the cost of housing or the cost of secure tenure in cities much higher than the rural areas, which essentially means our poverty lines need to be much higher for urban areas in order to ensure that we do not miss out on people who may be counted as economically self-sufficient based on their earnings, but when you look at housing as a criteria, they will be seen to be deprived in many important ways. Risk reduction is a function of social protection policies. Upgrading high-risk urban informal settlements through formalization of tenure, providing better housing in secure locations are examples of reducing risks for people. And these interventions need to have both structural and non-structural components. An example could be Thailand's Ban Man Kong program that promotes providing housing loans and subsidies to community-based organizations and informal settlements to enable low-income households to obtain legal tenures and move to safer types of housing. The Sustainable Development Goal 11 enshrines this whole understanding about housing as human right. Sustainable Development Goal 11 states that making cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient, and sustainable means that the poorer people in the cities need to have better living conditions. And housing is an important component of that. The target of SDG 11.1 is to provide access for all to basic services and to adequate, safe, and affordable housing. Policy and budgetary commitment on part of the governments must be made to improve and upgrade slum areas. Critically, examination of policy and development approach, pushing the poor in the country towards homelessness and distress migration has to be curbed. Governments also need to provide assistance and support to create housing, especially for the poor. Let us look at some of the housing schemes or policies that the government of India has implemented in the context of rural and urban areas. The National Slum Development Project NSDP 1996 aimed to upgrade slums throughout India. The NSDP intended to develop a model slum where civic amenities such as sewers, wider paved lanes, street lights, clean water, toilets were provided to the community members. Under the NSDP, the beneficiaries were provided loans to improve their housing, and the government invested in providing amenities. The NSDP lacked monitoring and suffered from delays, with only 70% of the budget utilized. It was not considered to be a very successful program. The Basic Services for the Urban Poor program was part of the larger Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission (JNNURM), which is a large-scale urban renewal mission. The BSUP aimed at constructing subsidized housing for urban poor, where the government agencies estimated the unit cost to be INR 300,000. For the same, the government decided to provide a housing subsidy of approximately 88%, with remaining 12% contribution by the beneficiaries. Housing for All 2015 is a policy framework which aims to provide housing to all Indian households by 2022. It has a really ambitious goal. And how does it wish to do it? The scheme focuses on in situ slum rehabilitation, under which the government encourages and incentivizes private developers to use land as resource. Housing for All also looks at slum upgradation by integrating beneficiary-driven housing construction. So the innovation in 2015 has been that so far the government has been providing loans and subsidies to individual members of the urban poor community and encouraging them to upgrade their own housing with support from government. The innovation in the Housing for All 2015 framework is that it's not the houses which is the prime focus, but the use of the urban land, which is quite scarce and highly valuable. The idea in this framework is to incentivize private developers to invest in this land to create housing for the poor. So in that sense, this is a movement away from existing ways of dealing with the housing situation. The broad components of the HFA 2015 include slum rehabilitation using land as a resource to involve private developers, public-private partnership to create affordable housing through the credit-linked interest subsidy, beneficiary-led individual house construction or enhancement. The government will provide slum areas with additional floor space index, resulting in vertical slums, and the freed space would be used by the private developers for commercial resale. This is viewed as an incentive for private developers to construct houses for eligible slum dwellers free of cost. The understanding is once land is freed of the primarily horizontal spread of urban informal settlements and people are persuaded to move into legally secure tenured houses constructed with investment from private builders, large amount of scarce urban land will be freed up, which the private developers can therefore sell at a market rate and using part of that part of their profits to subsidize urban housing for the poor. This in fact is a model that is being implemented in many large metro cities in the context of India. What are the criticisms that are made against HFA 2015? Does it really help for the poor to secure right to housing? The Housing for All scheme ignores the fact that eventually the household per hectare density would rise as a result of its design. The living conditions would be worsening in the absence of supporting infrastructure, civic amenities, widened roads or open spaces. Also, a scheme of this nature has promoted the mindset among slum dwellers that they are entitled to free housing without any financial or labor contribution. A combination of all of these factors going to be proved that essentially means that the HFA 2015 will not necessarily fulfill the conditions of SDG Goal 11 of building resilient cities or the housing or shelter as a basic human rights for the poor. When we look at the rural housing situation, one scheme that comes to mind, and it's the oldest scheme in housing in India, is the Indira Awas Yojana, IAY. Initiated in 1985, it aimed at providing housing assistance to the rural poor with a financial grant of Rs 70,000 per dwelling unit in the plains and Rs 75,000 for hilly difficult areas. Rural poor are encouraged to construct new housing and improved housing using this grant that is given to them from the government. In 2005, the government in place announced that the IAY will be merged with the Pradhan Mantri Awas Yojana. The new scheme aims to construct 30 million permanent houses in rural areas by 2022. It also states that the financial subsidy per unit will be increased. The subject of land and housing falls under the directive principles of state policy in the Indian Constitution. This essentially makes housing rights non-binding and non-enforceable in the court of law. At the same time, India is signatory to the international legal instruments upholding the human right to adequate housing. Article 11.1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which affirms that the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living for himself and his family, including adequate food, clothing and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living condition. This article can be interpreted to include right to housing in addition to other forms of social right that the state is accountable to the citizens for. When we look at the context of the Indian Constitution, the right to housing, as has been mentioned, a right to shelter, if you wish to call it that, is only present in the directive principles of state policy. However, in recent times, the Supreme Court has used the Article 21 or right to life to creatively interpret right to housing as intrinsically connected also to right to life. The Supreme Court of India elaborated on right to adequate housing, shelter and livelihood being part of the all-encompassing right to life under Article 21 of the Indian Constitution in the landmark case of Olga Tellis versus Bombay Municipal Corporation in 1985. In the case of Olga Tellis versus Bombay Municipal Corporation, the BMC has given notice to pavement dwellers who it considered to have been illegally occupying the land to leave. During that time, the cases argued that can a branch of the government ask a group of urban poor people to move or be displaced from their housing if it is unable to provide for them housing as part of public housing? Essentially, therefore, can the government take away people's housing and create conditions of further impoverishment and distress, and therefore affect people's right to life when it is unable to provide alternative housing for them. Similarly, in the case of Ahmedabad Municipal Corporation versus Nawab Gulab Khan and ORS 1997, the Supreme Court of India stated that the state has constitutional duty to provide shelter to make the right to life meaningful. There has been other situations and other cases where the Supreme Court has not ruled so progressively about the right to shelter and whether government is mandated to provide shelter rights to the poor urban or rural communities. In one of the cases in 2012, which is the case of night shelters, the Supreme Court had again directed states in northern India to provide night shelter facilities, even if it is temporary, to help protect people who lacked housing from being cold during the prolonged winter that had happened in that particular year. The court had argued that people sleeping under the open sky pavements in the night, even after 64 years of independence, was a breach of right to life guaranteed under the Constitution. Right to shelter was viewed as part of right to life guaranteed under Article 21 yet again, and it was obligatory on part of the state to protect and preserve human lives during the cold wave condition. The interesting thing about this declaration is, although the Supreme Court has been able to persuade the governments to provide night shelter, the nature of ruling still remains temporary. Basically, the right to shelter only till the cold wave persists, or only in conditions of such unseasonal calamities. It still does not proclaim that a right to shelter should be made available to all through public housing in case of social and economic poverty. This brings us to the role of state in the provisioning of housing in the context of India. The right to housing has at best found recognition through judicial interpretation under Article 21 of the Constitution. There has been no other situations where the government has intervened to make the right to housing possible, except for temporary schemes and of short duration, which has been addressed to specific groups of the population. Global housing shortage, however, is expected to reach 26.53 million units by 2012, and more than 95% of this shortage will pertain to the poor. Direct participation by the state in regulating and providing public housing, intervening in the land market through equitable user policies, rent regulation and enforcement measures, and a focus on affordable housing are recommended by observers in order to ensure that the poor in the rural and urban areas did not continue to suffer from various forms of hazards and debilitating living conditions because they do not have secure housing, both in terms of legal tenure and also in terms of physical condition and access to public goods, services and facilities. Housing can be viewed as central to a range of social policy concerns, including child rights and human security. And how does this actually happen? It is argued that if children are growing up for generations together in unsafe housing or insecure housing or living conditions which are dilapidated, then it also affects their learning, it also affects the way they are growing, and which would in future harm their abilities to benefit from economic development and also to utilize the opportunities that is emerging in a growing economy, which essentially means that rights of children to a good living condition and a good life, and also in order for them to achieve their potential, safe housing is an absolute necessity. Housing can also be viewed as a key precondition for human security in general. People living in unsafe housing are also susceptible to natural hazards. They are susceptible to fire. Recent examples include real life incidents like an occasion a couple of years back in the city of Mumbai when after a fire had broken out in an urban informal settlement, fire tenders were unable to enter the narrow lanes, poorly maintained narrow lanes of these urban informal settlements, and hence they were unable to douse the fire, leading to large-scale losses of life and property and other forms of losses that poorer people who are struggling to survive would find it even more difficult to emerge from poverty if such hazards destroy their already meager housing entitlements. Poor housing conditions affect health. Homelessness and frequent displacements can deepen insecurity and impair the ability of households to transition out of poverty. If we remember the lesson in social protection, we would know that social protection, the role of social protection is to be both creating preventive, promotive and transformative outcomes for poorer people, and not being able to provide reasonably good public housing, affordable housing in safe conditions with access to public services for people essentially means that many communities would unable to transition out of poverty. Housing poverty is a term that needs to be recognized to fully expand the understanding of poverty. Poverty, as you remember, is not just about income and consumption. Poverty has a large number of multidimensional features, and housing constitutes an important feature in deprivation. Housing poverty fails to find emphasis, however, as compared to health, education, and food security. Recent UN human rights report view housing crisis as a facet of unaddressed human right. As governments withdraw from public housing schemes all over the world because of a crunch on public finances and their need to be competitive in an increasingly competitive global economy, it is feared that right to shelter will be left to market solutions. And if such a scenario really happens and really takes place, it essentially means the urban poor and the rural poor and the large number of migrants who are now moving from rural to urban areas in order to utilize the livelihood opportunities that are emerging there would continue to be suffer from housing poverty and are never be able to obtain shelter rights. Thank you for participating in this module.